It's episode 182 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you that tune in each week. Without this large audience that we have, the show would not be possible, and I just wanted to say a real quick thank you for that. Please go over to hankgarner.com, and while you're there, click on the links in the right-hand sidebar. That's where you can subscribe to the show. Also, my books are for sale there, so if you would like to pick up a copy of Writer's Block or Mulligan or Seventh Son of a Seventh Son or Bloom, or any of my short stories, please pick those up. It would mean a lot to me, and it helps the show as well. I'd like to thank some sponsors this week, and if you would like to be a sponsor of the show, send me an email at authorhankgarner@outlook.com. I would be happy to talk to you about it. Sponsors for this week: Richard Gleaves. His Jason Crane series is one of my favorite book series of the last several years. We're going to have an audio clip at the end of the show from it, but the entire trilogy is finished. I know some people are hesitant to get into a new book when the rest of it's not finished. The entire trilogy is finished, and you can get a sample of it at the end of the show. Also, my good friend Ed Gosney, he runs a blog called Cool Comics My Collection, and it's one of these things that every week when Ed posts, it just makes me happy because Ed finds the cool things about comics, and he finds something new each week to write about, a collection of comics, and brings out some history and maybe some things that you didn't know. So check out edgosney.com. I've got a short clip from you from Draft to Digital and from Stefan Boltz, and then into our show with Jonathan Maberry. Thank you for listening. Six String, the new book by Stefan Boltz. Jennifer Dalton dreamed of being a singer for as long as she could remember. The dream has kept her alive throughout a childhood mired in poverty in a broken and abusive home. When her younger brother dies and her mother takes refuge in alcohol, the emotional toll becomes unbearable. One morning she runs away, taking with her the one thing she owns, her beloved six-string guitar. This is the story of a girl finding herself alone in the good and the bad, the friends she makes, and a choice that could rob her of everything she's won. Six String by Stefan Boltz, now available on Amazon.com.
Hey there, Author Story listeners. This is Kevin Tomlinson from Draft to Digital, and I know that you have a book sitting there just waiting to get out to the world, and you're kind of wondering what the next steps are. So that's why you need to go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories. That's draft2digital.com/authorstories, and that's where you're going to find all the help you need to go from having a book on your hard drive to having it on someone's Kindle or iPad or other reading device. So go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories right now.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I've got Jonathan Maberry, who is no stranger to this listening audience, I assure you. Jonathan has his hands in just about every project and genre going on in publishing right now, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the show. Welcome, Jonathan.
Happy to be here, Hank. Thanks for having me.
Sure. When I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
That actually does go way back, because I'm one of those people that always wanted to write. So even before I could read and write, I was telling stories with toys. And I actually remember telling a pretty elaborate story using all of my toy stuffed animals and my sister's Barbie dolls and my early G.I. Joes, which when I was a kid were 12 inches tall, in some elaborate rambling story. And my neighbors, my friends and my friends' parents were very tolerant, sitting and listening to it. I have no idea what story it was or where it went, but I remember being very enthusiastic about telling it.
Were you a big reader when you were young?
I was always a reader. I started out mostly in comic books, though, partly because it took my parents and the teachers at school a long time to figure out that I needed glasses. So for the first couple of years in school, I was actually not a very good student because I was not able to read the stuff off the board properly. They thought I was just being lazy. but I could read comics because of the pictures, and the word balloons were a little easier to follow. Then they figured out that I needed glasses, and after that I began devouring books and just never stopped devouring books.
I love that. I had a similar experience with comics, but mine was dyslexia, and the combination of the pictures and the words just really transformed the way I approached reading, and I'll be forever grateful. So I can commiserate with you there in that comics was kind of a saving grace. At what point did you go from this kid with an imagination and telling stories to I think I want to be a writer, like this is a career that I could do?
Probably in 7th grade, we had an opportunity to write stories for a school, like this little journal they were putting out in my middle school. And very few kids in my middle school, well, first off, very few kids in middle school read, let alone wrote. And not too many of them submitted material, so I wound up submitting enough stuff in the hopes of getting one story in there that I wound up being like 3/4 of the book.
Wow!
And wow, that looks nice seeing my name in print. I kind of dig that. So I decided to let them encourage me a little more. And my English teacher said, "Well, if you like writing, write something else." So I would turn in my writing assignments, all the time, usually a little more than they asked. A lot of short stories, and but when I was in high school, I actually wanted to go to journalism school because I wanted to become a newspaper guy first, and I wound up getting a scholarship to do that, and went off to I think it was in junior year of college rather, when I submitted my first article to a magazine and went up selling it. So I was kind of off and running at that point.
What was it about the newspaper business that intrigued you?
Well, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager rather, it was during the 70s, and it was the Watergate thing. So Woodward and Bernstein were superheroes to us. They told a corrupt president, a corrupt government. And, I wanted to be both Woodward and Bernstein, so I that was my thing. Plus, my favorite cartoon at the time, favorite comic strip, was Doonesbury, and he wanted to be a writer, and the guy who wrote and drew it, Gary Trudeau, had won a Pulitzer. And I'm like, wow, you can have fun and tell stories and make a career. So that was kind of my goal. And for the first 23 or 25 years of my writing career, I wrote nonfiction stuff part-time while I did other things during the day, and didn't turn to fiction until the 2000s.
Wow. So what sort of nonfiction were you writing during that time?
Well, they always say write what you know, and I've been doing martial arts since I was 6. So my first article that I pitched was on jiu-jitsu, which is the martial art that I practiced and teach. And I wound up selling about 600 martial arts articles over the years to all the major martial arts magazines here and other countries. And along the way, I also started writing other things. I wrote another close to 600 or 700 feature articles on other things. I wrote about skydiving, which was one of my hobbies, and blues music and traveling, and pretty much anything that caught my interest. I started doing a lot of science articles too. And so I did about 12 or 1,300 feature articles and about 3,000 reviews and columns over the years, a lot of stuff. And I did a whole bunch of nonfiction books. Originally, they were textbooks for courses I was teaching at Temple University when I became a teacher there. I taught women's self-defense, martial arts, history, jiu-jitsu, and a few other classes. And I wrote my textbooks, and I wrote textbooks for some of my friends who taught but weren't necessarily writers. So I wound up writing the archery textbook, the bowling, the judo, and a few other textbooks. So, all of my early stuff was, it was about martial arts or my hobbies or whatever interested me that day, and did pretty good as a side gig with that.
Yeah. What was that enough for you to scratch the writing itch those years?
Oh yeah. I was selling everything that I was writing, and that's pretty validating and a lot of
Absolutely.
Fun. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough for me to live on. There were times I made more money writing than I did teaching, but mostly it was a side gig, and it was a very rewarding side gig. But for quite a while, I still defined myself as a teacher, even though at heart I wanted to be a full-time writer.
Yeah.
But that changed when I wrote my first novel.
Yeah. So what possessed you to tackle fiction? After you had been doing this for so long, and I would imagine had kind of established yourself as someone who you could turn to for quality nonfiction, and you had contacts made in those worlds. Kind of what got you to fiction?
Well, it's kind of a two-part answer, because after being a magazine feature writer part-time, and this was, a good chunk of this was before the internet days.
Right.
So, all of this was done through mail. I actually didn't know very many writers while I was actually writing. I had known some when I was a kid through my school librarian, but while I was writing, I didn't know many writers. And after a while, I got burned out on it. It just became tedious to me because there's no one to talk to about it. I'm not going to talk to people about the subject matter, but the actual craft of writing and the struggles of a writer, I had no one to talk to. So finally, my wife kind of nudged me, which is a nice way of saying kick me in the ass, to go to a writer's conference. To a writer's class, not necessarily to learn something new, but to be around other people who write. And it was a great idea. I went. The teachers were professionals, and other people in the class were really earnest about it. And then from there, shortly after that class started, I found out that the two people running the class also were on the board of the Philadelphia Writers Conference, and they encouraged us all to go. And I went there, and it was amazing. It was a life-changing event, because I was around suddenly hundreds of writers of all levels, from absolute beginner to New York Times bestsellers, and it was so rewarding to be around others of my species. I found that some of the same doubts and fears that I had, some of the challenges I had, were not unique to me. They were shared by everyone who writes. And that was really encouraging. Also, it kind of gave me more of an interest in following some of the advice I had gotten early on, which is, try anything as a writer. So I started getting interested in fiction. I started reading a lot more fiction at the time. Roll forward a couple of years, actually right around that time, I did a nonfiction book on my first non-martial arts nonfiction book. I wrote about the folklore, mythology, and legends of supernatural predators, vampires, werewolves, and so on. I've always had interest in supernatural. And it was for a small press. The publisher at the time wanted me to use a pen name because he thought that my martial arts readers would think I'd had some sort of a neurological accident, something with vampires. What happened is that book, The Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead, which was published under the pen name of Shane MacDougall, went about selling my martial arts books like 30 to 1.
Wow.
And it got me more and more interested in the horror world. I actually started getting to know people in the horror writers community, the Horror Writers Association, and felt like I was home. So one of my problems was I wanted to read fiction that had a folklore base to the horror, to the monsters, rather than the Hollywood versions, because the vampires in Hollywood and the werewolves in Hollywood bear no resemblance at all to the vampires and werewolves in folklore. None. Things like sunlight and stakes and all that, all of that came from fiction. It was not part of any vampire folklore anywhere in the world. And I had just written this, 700-page book on folklore, and I couldn't find fiction that touched on it. My wife said, "Oh, for God's sake, stop complaining about it. Just write the damn thing." So I wrote the damn thing as an experiment to see if I would like writing fiction. And I wrote the book that I wanted to read, and that was Ghost Road Blues. And I was very surprised when I got an agent very quickly, and she sold it to the third publisher who looked at it, and it went on to win the Bram Stoker Award for Best First Novel. And when you talk about validation of something, that really that validated the hell out of me wanting to write.
Well,
wanting to write fiction, and I never looked back.
Heck yeah! I mean, and of course you can't necessarily say this is the first thing you'd written, because you'd been writing for years and years, and you had developed those muscles, as it were. But fiction's a very different thing. How did you, when you kind of launched into this fiction project, what were some of the things that you realized pretty early on that this is a different skill set? Like, what things did you start to realize that you had to build other muscles for?
Well, first off, I realized I didn't know a damn thing about writing fiction. I'd read a lot of it, but I didn't know the skill set. Yeah. I mean, there's a certain skill set that goes into articles, or a certain skill set that goes into reviews and nonfiction books, but fiction's a whole different animal. And I'd never taken a creative writing course. I'd taken a writing class, the journalism class, and then that one adult ed class that kind of got me into the writers' conference. But it wasn't fiction. So I decided to teach myself how to do it. I read a lot about what the elements of fiction are, figurative language, voice, pace, tone, all those things, point of view. And I took the 6 novels that were my favorites in the genre I wanted to write. I read them again as a reader and read them multiple times as a writer. And I deconstructed them. I wrote the outlines that I thought might have been the basis for them. I looked for the 3-act structure. I looked for the elements of craft. Like, when is the author using figurative descriptive language? When is he using omniscient voice? Is he using third person, first person? All the different elements of style I looked for, found them, and educated myself on how to write a novel. And then when I sat down to write my own, I didn't want to write like those guys. I wanted to write a novel that would be read by the same people who loved their books. And it took me 3.5 years to write my first novel. And that was, but in the process, it was like going to college. I learned how to write fiction by paying attention to how it was written well.
Right. And I love the thing that you said a minute ago about you wrote the book that you wanted to read. I think that is utterly important. There's so many people that give advice that you should write to this market or that market and kind of, hold your finger up to the winds and see where things are going. But if you are not your very first reader, I think as Stephen King puts it, you are your first reader. If you don't like the story, then surely no one else is. It's crucially important.
Yeah. And I have to enjoy not only the process of reading a book, I have to enjoy the process of writing one. I write the books I would go out of my way to buy. Not just books that would appeal to me, books that I would go out of my way to buy. So I'm actually writing for me. I don't write for the trend. I don't write for the market. I mean, I when I'm pitching something, I do pay attention to what's going on in the business. That's why I work with my agent and that. But when I'm actually writing, I don't try to pander. I write the book that I would really enjoy reading. And as a result, I have a lot of fun writing, and I think that my enthusiasm, my fun in it, shows through in the writing, and it's helped me become very successful.
That first book, Ghostword Blues. You said that you intentionally tried to be true to the actual legends, the actual folklore of these creatures and their stories. How do you think that was received by the community of people who are used to seeing those Hollywoodizations, if I can coin a phrase?
Well, it's funny. Because the book sold well and, a lot of people read it, there are a lot of different types of reactions to it. A lot of people thought it was a fresh, new take on monsters. And actually, it's more like going old school. So in interviews and in public appearances, I went up doing a lot of talking about the folklore and why certain bits of the vampire folklore are in Hollywood and so on. It's like the whole thing about a vampire disintegrating after it's been staked is a convenience so that the directors didn't have to waste story time on screen having the bodies carted away. The thing about vampires being killed by sunlight was never in folklore. I mean, Dracula walked around in sunlight in the book. It was there because when they were filming the silent film Nosferatu, half the crew had walked off because they weren't getting paid anymore. They were over budget, over time, and they could not afford to to film the big dramatic ending that they had planned. So the lighting guy said to the director, he was one of the few guys that hadn't left, he said, "Look, we've been shooting the vampire in darkness all along. why don't we make it that he can't abide the light, that the light is too pure and he can't abide it, and that sunlight would kill him. The director's like, sure, fine, whatever, let's shoot that. And suddenly sunlight's now an element of vampire storytelling. In the whole thing about vampires not being able to enter a house unless invited was there because when Bram Stoker was writing Dracula, he made Dracula so powerful in the first third of the book, when it's set in Transylvania, that by the time Dracula got to England, he kind of realized, oh crap, he's going to kill everyone in the first 5 minutes he's there. So he had to impose limitations on him. And I know this because at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, they have all of Bram Stoker's research notes in cases. And I used to do lectures, every Halloween with those notes, and it showed, his notes to himself about why he was doing certain things. So a lot of it is education. And once people realize that you're going old school, they become really interested in what the actual story was, and it becomes a lot more fun then to be able to bring them back in time to what made people actually afraid of the dark.
Yeah,
and it was great. Plus, since the characters in the story, knew about vampires and werewolves from pop culture, they were they were trying to use what they learned from books and movies to fight monsters and getting killed, and that made a nice little novel twist. And of course, I introduced a folklorist there who would explain, you guys are getting killed because you don't know what the hell you're doing. So, you had that little proxy for me in the middle of the story.
I love it. And as with most of your writing, you have this way of injecting this wry sense of humor and levity.
The nicest smart ass I've ever had. Thank you.
Well, I was trying to be gracious. But there, I think, and I try to do the same thing, when I can, is to, it is important sometimes to have that character that's a bit of a smart ass, or, to take some situations that are, gruesome and, hard and to inject a little bit of levity there. Is that something you consciously do, or is it just sort of a little bit of you that comes out?
A little bit of both, because when people are scared, they tend to crack jokes because it eases tension, and often humor as a storytelling device is a great way of setting up something that's going to be a real shock. And I wanted to make sure that I included as much humor as I could in my stories, because if you're chuckling about something, you really don't expect things to go bad, really bad right now. And you see that in shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which had really good dramatic moments to it, surrounded by a lot of humor, and it somehow made the drama much more powerful and poignant.
Yeah, I like that they're kind of seasonings that go together, the tension, the horror, and the humor. I like that. What did you follow up that book with? So you found an audience, people liked it, and you realized that as a writer, this was something you could do. So what did you do from there?
Well, as I was writing the book, I realized that the story I wanted to tell was much bigger than would fit even into one long book. So I mapped it out originally as a duology, and then I expanded it to a trilogy. So when I pitched it to my agent, I said, look, it's a horror novel that can technically be a standalone, but has very strong series potential because there are elements that are left unresolved deliberately. So, pitch it as a trilogy. And the first publisher, in fact, who read it, Random House, they wanted the editor wanted to buy it, but the marketing people said, well, there aren't really horror trilogies out there, which was kind of true in 2005. And we don't really think a horror trilogy would sell. So even though the editor liked it, he had to reject it. Then 2 editors later, the editor said, oh, a horror trilogy. We think that's a great idea. And that's why they bought it.
It just took someone with some marketing vision.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny how that works sometimes in publishing. You never quite get the logic sometimes about what's going on, because it's so incredibly subjective in publishing.
Right.
Everyone has an opinion. Everyone's a little crazy.
and you have to make decisions that you can sleep with at night, because, imagine the people that have turned down, any number of projects that went on to be huge successes. And, that's got to be a crazy way to live.
Yeah. And I mean, there are writers who incredibly successful writers whose books have been rejected more than mine have, who went on to become like massive sellers. I mean, look at Harry Potter, for God's sake. It's rejected over and over and over again as a story that would never possibly sell, never find an audience. Yeah.
So you obviously found your voice in writing horror, but you don't only write horror. You also write some YA and some dystopian and comic books. I definitely want to talk about that in just a minute. But movie novelizations, how did your career start to evolve after this trilogy and you'd really made a name for yourself?
Well, winning the Bram Stoker Award was big. And a year later, I won another Bram Stoker Award for a nonfiction book on one of my folklore books. So that brought me on a lot of radars, kind of gave me more career visibility. But the fourth novel I wrote, I wanted to write a thriller. I love thrillers. I read a ton of thrillers. Yeah. And I was aware that my readers, the ones who had become really dedicated after the Pine Deep trilogy, the Ghost Red Bluesman sequels, I wanted to make sure that they would be entertained by the horror, and I love horror. So I figured out a way to do a special ops thriller with weird science and zombies. And I wrote a novel called Patient Zero, which, again, had been intended to be a standalone. And when my agent took it to a different editor, and when he saw it, he said, well, I want this one, and I want the next two in the series. And my agent said, so what are the next two in the series? I'm like, series? What series was that now? So I went up having to come up with different ideas, and each book had a different, weird science plot. Not every book has a horrific element to it. First one dealt with zombies, medically created zombies. Second one dealt with transgenic science. Third one dealt with politics. So each book in the series gets weirder and different. And so I did that, and then around that time, I got a reach out from Universal Pictures asking if I wanted to do the novelization for The Wolfman. The new version of The Wolfman. And as it turns out, yes, I did want to do the novelization for that.
Of course you did.
So I did. And that was my first New York Times bestseller. It was an audio bestseller and a print bestseller.
Nice.
It won the Scribe Award, and it propelled me forward. So from then on, I just kept writing the books that I wanted to write. I got into YA because my agent actually bullied me into YA. I had written a novella for an anthology edited by Christopher Golden, a zombie anthology, and he had asked each of the writers to do something beyond their comfort zone. And at the time, I'd never written something with a teen protagonist. I'd never written a post-apocalyptic story. So I did that, post-apocalyptic story about a teen. It was not written for kids, though. My agent read it and said, that's the opening of a young adult novel. And I'm like, it's not. And she won that. And she went up shopping the novella as if it was the opening of a novel and sold it and three sequels as the Rotten Ruin series to Simon & Schuster.
Wow.
And from there, I was approached by a group to do a novel based on a supernatural, alt history, steampunk, Western fantasy tabletop board game called Deadlands, where they pretty much allowed me to do anything I wanted. And I said, well, I'll only do it if you let me put zombie velociraptors in there. And they're like, yeah, sure. That is a joke. And then I was like, oh, well, I guess now I have to figure out how to put zombie velociraptors in there, which I did.
It's kind of like the Van Halen's brown M&Ms. It's one of those things that becomes legendary as you.
Yeah, it started as a joke, and their brown M&Ms thing was started as a joke.
Right.
And I've done a lot of stuff since then. I've been doing a lot of short stories, and a lot of those are reach outs from anthologists and editors saying, hey, I'm doing an anthology on this. Would you be willing to write a story? And it might have been, sometimes it's something way outside my comfort zone, like a straight Western, a story set in the land of Oz, a lot of media tie-in stuff like Planet of the Apes and G.I. Joe and so on. And they just ask me if I want to write stories, and a lot of the times I'm game because it's something I haven't done before.
Well, that speaking of that, when you find something that's outside your comfort zone and something that you've never done before, how do you approach those? Do you look at them differently? Do you find some sort of tie-in that you can latch onto that makes you feel comfortable in that, or do you just kind of jump in with both feet and look around at the world and figure out what's going on?
A little bit of both. Sometimes I'm a fan of it, like Planet of the Apes. I was a fan of the movie series going back to the original, which I saw when I was 10. I know the world enough to be able to want to play in it. And of course, I do my homework. I rewatch the movies, reread the books, and so on. With Oz, who doesn't love Oz? I grew up with Oz, and doing that actually became one of my career high points, because I originally wanted to write a horror story set in Oz, but the Tin Man getting the heart of a serial killer going on a rampage, which I figured my audience would have liked. But then again, as I was sitting down, I'm like, well, that's not the audience who reads Oz books, the kids. So I wound up writing something completely different about a little winged monkey girl whose wings are too small for her to fly, so she has to find magic traveling shoes. The story was so well received that I got a letter from the L. Frank Baum estate saying that it has been officially accepted as part of the official prehistory of Oz.
Wow.
That was insane. Absolutely insane. I actually broke down and cried. That was one of the most wonderful moments of my entire writing career. And if I hadn't been willing to try going outside my comfort zone, I never would have even considered that book, let alone had that happen. So yeah, it's worth trying to flex your creative muscles as often as you can.
So I haven't read that story, but it sounds to me like you found a way to take this creature that we all associate as being, the evil henchman, so to speak, in the movie and the books, and gave her some odd humanity.
Well, actually, there's a little bit about that. In the books, the flying monkeys could speak, and they were forced into being slaves for the witch. They were not evil. They were slaves. So I went with, my story is set before the witch became the witch that we know. She was younger then. So the flying monkeys had not yet been enslaved. And they were a noble race of good-hearted little creatures.
I love it. That's fantastic. Back just a minute to when you talked about how much you love thrillers and you wanted to write in that genre. How do you differentiate thriller from horror, and where do you draw those lines?
Well, horror often, but not always, deals with something supernatural, something beyond our control, and it's usually a much more personal story. A haunting, a possession, a vampire trying to get you. A thriller is a broader category in which there is a very definite race against time to prevent something very bad from happening. Some horror falls into that category. Dracula, the end of Dracula, is in fact a thriller, because they're trying to race against time to prevent him from escaping, because he plans to rise and conquer the world. So that's a thriller. Whereas Shirley Jackson's The Haunting is a suspense story. It's all about what's happening in the moment, and it isn't a race against time. It's oh my God, what's happening now? So horror can be suspense, it could be thriller, it could be comedy, it could be anything. So horror is a very nebulous term. I mean, Silence of the Lambs is both a thriller, because it's a race against time to prevent another family from being killed, and at the same time, to prevent a woman from being killed, and at the same time, it's a horror novel that won the Bram Stoker Award as Best Horror Novel of the Year. So the lines tend to blur a bit, and that allows for a lot of creative freedom and crossing of lines.
The Rotten Ruin series that you mentioned a minute ago, I think a lot of people know you from that series. How did what's the genesis of that story? Where did it come from?
Well, as I said, it was a novella I wrote for Chris Golden, and I just wrote a story about two brothers, an older and younger brother, and I wanted to explore the dynamic of two brothers who don't like each other, but because they lived through a calamity that destroyed the world, and therefore destroyed any of the comfort and family structure that might have given them a sense of peace and mutual understanding. And then as the younger brother, the one who has the most skewed worldview, comes to understand what his brother is, who he is, what he does, and what the world is, it's a coming-of-age not so much in literal age, but a coming of age as he grows up in his perception of the world. And once you understand what the world really is, it then is up to you whether you want to close your eyes and pretend it's not real, or accept the reality and live within that world. And it was a great story to write. I just recently sold a new series set in the same world but with different characters, different part of the country, and it'll come out next year. It's Rotten Ruin, Broken Lands, and it's set in southern Texas with a teenage girl protagonist, and it'll give a different point of view to the apocalypse and to survival and to heroism.
You've sold the film rights to the Rotten Ruin series, haven't you?
Yes and no. It was optioned by a producer, and they were working on it, on script and so on, and that producer then wound up getting the gig to be the head writer for a very popular TV show called Scorpion. And, massive show, and he's the head writer, which means he's head of a writing team and so on, showrunner. He just didn't have the time to work on an indie feature. So he gave the rights back to me, very amicably. And now another producer is reading it, and it's likely to be optioned. My guess is the new series with the female protagonist is the one that will probably film.
You think it has? It's going to be the one that breaks through. That's awesome. We can't reach for it.
I do, because it's a more contemporary story in that it's a Latina female character set in the story is set in southern Texas near the ruins of a wall. Let you decide what wall you think that is, and it deals a lot with how politics and polarization and so on get in the way of people of survival.
Right.
So there's a little bit of contemporary stuff in there.
You are obviously not a young Latina. Is it?
I don't know.
Are there any tricks that you use to get into the head of another character to so that you can authentically speak for that person?
Well, a lot of it's observation. I was even though I was not a young girl, I was a young boy who had a lot of female friends. I also grew up with 4 sisters, so that helps. And like any writer, when you inhabit the mind of a character, you're inhabiting the logic that goes along with who they are. So Thomas Harris was not a psychiatrist who ate people, and yet he was able to write Hannibal Lecter with great reality. Nor was he a female cadet at the FBI Academy, and yet Clarice Starling had great reality. So we inhabit different characters, and once you inhabit the character, there is an internal logic to who they are, what they do, how they react, and so on. So I just get into those headspaces, and I've had a little practice of this too, because in the Rotten Ruin series there are several strong girl characters that are co-stars to the series, and I did a book called X-Files Origins. It was the X-Files Origins series. I did the book Devil's Advocate, which is about Dana Scully as a 15-year-old. So I have written about teens before, and teen girls, and I don't find it that difficult to inhabit different kinds of heads, different races, human and otherwise, different personality types, and so on. I find it pretty easy to get inside those heads.
Love it. You've also written a number of comic books that have been really popular. Did you continue to read comics? I know that you said that you started reading comics. A lot of us kind of stop reading those when we discover girls and cars and all that sort of thing. Kind of what's your story with comics?
Well, I read comics pretty diligently from I think 1966 through 1990. Okay. But toward the late 80s, early 90s, comics were going through a really bad time. They were not well done. There's a lot of criticism about that era, and I kind of fell out of love with them. So I stopped reading them. And then in 2008, out of the blue, I got a phone call from the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, who had just finished reading Patient Zero, and he said, "I read your book. I love your dialogue. I love your action. Have you ever thought about maybe writing comics?" I'm like, I almost said out loud, "That is the stupidest question I've ever been asked." Luckily, I didn't say that out loud. What I said was, why, yes, I actually have given that some thought, and I might be willing to give it a try. So my first comic was an 8-page Wolverine short, and I was off and running. And
so was that like a backup story
most of my comics,
in an issue or something?
Yeah, it was Wolverine anniversary issue. It was the backup story, and I had a lot of fun writing it. It was a kind of a contemporary meditation on life and death, with Wolverine killing a bunch of the Hand and thinking about the death of the woman he loved, and how death seems to be the only constant in his life. So I had a good time with that story. It was very well received, and I went from there to writing, Punisher, and did a whole bunch of other comics for Marvel. And they recently reprinted a bunch of my comics. All my Black Panther comics have been reprinted in one volume. I've got reprints of my Punisher stuff and reprints of my Wolverine stuff out there that Marvel just put out. So nice popular demand for it, which is great.
Writing comics is a very different skill, it seems like to me, because you're scripting them, and you need to hit certain points or certain notes at the end of a page, at the beginning of a new page. How long did you kind of work on that skill before you got that where you were good at it?
Well, it's an ongoing process. The first comic is usually, if you're a novelist going to write comics, your first comic is going to be horribly overwritten, way too much dialogue. And in this particular case, it was captions. It was inside Wolverine's head, and there's too much of it. So much so that the artist sent me a note saying, I love your writing, but at some point I'd like people to see my artwork and all the words written away. And I'm like, yes. So when you're writing a novel, it's all you, and you've got thousands of words and hundreds of pages to tell your story. In comics, it's you, it's the artist, it's the letterer, the colorist, and the editor all together collaborating on it. I mean, you write the script, but they all have input that plays to their strengths, and ultimately you want to create something that is going to work predominantly as a visual medium, telling the story with dialogue and captions only where it is necessary. So the tendency for me was to overwrite and then learn over time to scale back the dialogue and give notes to the artist so that the artist could tell the story I want told. And it is a process. And, it's fun.
How does that relationship between the writer and the artist work? Do you give him or her instructions on this is how I see the scene, this is how I'd like it portrayed? Do they interpret what you've written? Like that, there has to be a lot of give and take there, I would think.
There's a lot of give and take, and you write a pretty extensive script. I mean, it ranges, like Alan Moore, he'll write 10 pages of notes just for a single panel, and then tends to go to the other extreme. But generally, if it's a 20-page comic, it's going to be like a 35-page script, because the writer decides how many panels there are going to be and what art is in each panel. And since the artist you work with could be anywhere in the world, like my artist on Wolverine versus the Marvel Universe was in Croatia. My artist for something else was in Scotland, and another one was in Chile. So they won't necessarily have the same cultural references. So if you, for example, want a scene set in Central Park, it's a good idea to maybe pull up URLs of images so they can see exactly what it looks like, for real, as opposed to just imagining a park in a city. So I have description plus URLs, and in the Black Panther comic, I was writing the comic when Shuri, the sister of T'Challa, was the Panther, and I'd come up with having been a women's self-defense instructor my whole life, I had a very specific way I wanted her to fight. So I actually took photos of from some of the articles I'd written about self-defense and included the JPEGs with the script, so the artist then could see what the exact technique looked like so that they got it right. I hate it when martial arts techniques are done wrong in books and comics and movies. So I wanted to be very precise. So, this, and the artist liked that because it allowed him to do a much more precise piece of art, and, the artist gets credit for doing it right. So it was mutually beneficial.
You talked about the Wolverine story that you did originally, and it seems to me that type of story, that reflective, contemplative, looking at all of the death and destruction around you, and you are the survivor that's seen all this stuff. That character lends himself very well to that type of storytelling. What is it like inheriting these characters that we all have known and loved for decades, and they have all this history and all of these preconceived ideas and notions, and then you get to take them and do new things with them? How is it different writing with this pantheon of characters compared to creating your own?
It's a challenge. You got to do your homework, and I hadn't read comics from 1990 to 2008, so I had to go back and reread a ton of stuff from the intervening years. And it's not like Marvel sends you every comic. Yeah, I actually went up having to go out and buy trades, trade graphic novels, so I could catch up. And you want to make sure you're fair to the character without just merely echoing everything that's been done. With Punisher, I wanted to do some new things. With Black Panther, I did a lot of new things because I had the female Black Panther, and T'Challa was injured and recovering. So I wanted to go with that storyline, which was started by Reggie Hudlin on his run, but also I wanted to go in new directions with it. I wanted to make the comic much more political. So you have to respect it, but anytime you make even the slightest change, there's going to be backlash. And there was some backlash to some of what I wrote, but overall the response was very positive. They liked a kind of a fresh take on it, and that's what keeps the comic industry going, are these fresh takes.
Yeah. You've also done some of your own comics, some creator-owned stuff. What are some of the other ones you've done?
Well, my first comic that was not a superhero comic was Bad Blood. It was a 5-issue limited I did for Dark Horse with Tyler Crook doing all of the art, the lettering, the covers, and everything. He did an amazing job. And it was a vampire story about a kid with leukemia who is pitted against vampires, and the only superpower he has is that his blood, with all the chemo drugs, is toxic to him. And it winds up poisoning the king of the vampires. And it was not the feel-good story of the year. And I had a great time writing it, and it won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Graphic Novel. And, it validated my creator-owned comic vibe. And then when I started doing some anthologies, prose anthologies for IDW Comics, and went up doing two runs for them. I got a lot of requests to do a Rot and Ruin comic, but I didn't want to adapt the Rot and Ruin books, so I just did a 5 or 6 issue mini. It was a standalone, self-contained story set between books 3 and 4 2 and 3 rather, the Rot and Ruin series, called Warrior Smart, and I really enjoyed that. And then I did 3 storylines in the V-Wars series, which is my Vampire Apocalypse series that had started as prose anthologies. I did 3 runs of that, which were collected in 2 graphic novels. And that was a lot of fun. And that was the last comic I did. I've become so insanely busy with novels. I'm writing 4 novels a year right now. I haven't had as much time to do comics, but I do intend to go back to it.
Love it. You are also one of the 3 Guys with Beards from the 3 Guys with Beards podcast. How did that come about?
Mm-hmm. Chris Golden, Jim Moore, and I are old friends. And we were at Dragon Con a couple of years ago and sitting around. And we're also trivia nuts, and we're also pop culture geeks. I mean, like really ridiculous pop culture geeks. We know pop culture references that a lot of people just don't get. So out of just joking, we were all sitting around at the bar at the Westin at Dragon Con in Atlanta, and I said, we ought to do a show where the 3 of us sit around with one guest, and we just talk about stuff that only we know and make the guest feel like an idiot. And we laughed about that, but then we started realizing, I think it was James Moore said, that probably would make a good podcast without the humiliation aspect. We should do a podcast. And I said, yeah, maybe we should, we should 3 Guys with Beards, And that was the end of the idea for then. And then a few weeks later, Jim contacts me and says, all right, we're all set up to record our first podcast. I'm like, wait, what now? And he said, yeah, 3 Guys with Beards. We're a go. We're going to launch it at HorrorCon and a World Horror Convention, and we'll do it the first show live. I'm like, wait a minute, when did we all agree to actually do this? But it was such a great idea that Chris and I are like, yeah, let's rock and roll. So we launched it there, and we've been doing it for a couple of years now and having the best time. And it's been a lot of fun too, because we've gotten a lot of really great guests on it. We've had actors, producers, we've had novelists of all kinds, comic book writers and artists. It's great. Like among our recent guests, James Marsters, who played Spike on Buffy, Jimmy Palmiotti, and Kevin Eastman, who did the co-creator of Ninja Turtles, was on. Scott Adsit, who was on 30 Rock, who was also the voice of Big Hero 6. Just on and on. A lot of fun people who make for great guests and great variety. So we're having a blast. In fact, we're recording another episode of the show in about an hour.
James Marsters also narrated all of the Dresden Files audiobooks and did a fantastic job with those. Yeah,
he did.
Really good stuff.
We talked about those books and his performance and so on. And he's also charming, funny, and extremely intelligent, and just a great guy to talk to. So, if anyone wants to find the Three Guys with Beards podcast, they can just look on iTunes or just look Three Guys with Beards, and links will pop up everywhere.
You are an extremely prolific writer. You crank out work like almost no one that I've talked to. Speaking and including some new projects that you've got coming out that we're going to highlight here in just a second. But as a working writer, are there any things that you've learned that you could encourage other writers with who may be struggling with just getting the work done?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important things is stop mythologizing the process of being a writer. You don't need to put on your writer's jacket, get your pipe, wait for inspiration to hit, and all that crap. Sit down and write. And if it's not right, fix it in the rewrite, but just write. Write every day. Don't take days off. If you write every day, you get better every day. If you don't write every day, you lose ground. Have fun. Only write the things that are fun for you. But complete everything that you write, because very, very few people, maybe less than 1% of people who sit down to write, finish something. And of those people, unfortunately, too many of them judge their writing on the quality of a first draft. Every first draft that has ever been written is what we call the ugly first draft. It's clunky, it's filled with problems and mistakes. So what? So go through, make a list of everything that's wrong with that complete first draft, and that's your to-do list to go and fix it. And one other really important thing for writers who want to get into the biz and do something, like make a career out of it, understand the difference between writing and publishing. Writing is an art. It is the intimate conversation that we have with our readers. Publishing is a business whose sole concern is selling copies of art. It is not about art. It is about selling copies of things. Now, the people in publishing may love books, and many of them do. Many of them came into publishing because of their love of books. But it's still a business that has to make a profit and has to sell profitable books. So if your book is being rejected, it doesn't mean that you are a bad person and a bad writer and should give up. It means it doesn't fit the business model, the editorial needs of that editor at that time. And that's it. So send it somewhere else. If you need to, polish it again, but keep sending it out. And while that's out being shopped around, write something else, and maybe try writing outside your comfort zone, because that might be the thing that breaks you in. But learn what the business of publishing is. There are plenty of newsletters, like Publishers Weekly has a lot of free newsletters that you can read to get an idea of what's going on in the publishing world. It's worth subscribing to them. It's worth knowing the business thing. And I know for a fact that my agent, one of the things that most urged her to sign me was not just my writing. She was not even a fan of horror. She liked the fact that I was business savvy and that I could talk business and that understood, the needs of business. And that made me more appealing to her as a client, because she didn't have to worry about me being an emotional prima donna who was afraid that anything I wrote would be messed with, and that was like touching the books of the Bible. You can't mess with a word of it. It's a product. It can be polished, shaped, refitted, whatever, to make it the most saleable possible version. That's how publishing works. Deal with that. And if you can deal with that, you are going to do really, really well in this business.
That's fantastic. And speaking of the business, I'm going to put links in the show notes to your Amazon page where this week they can pick up a new release of yours, and you've got some other brand new stuff out. You want to touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, the last 2 months, well, first of all, 2017 has become, I think, my busiest year for releases. I've already had 2 short story collections released this year. Whistling Past the Graveyard, which is my second hardcover collection of short fiction, and then there's a special 4-story little mini book called The Little Bronze Book of Cautionary Tales that's out. Several of my graphic novels, including Black Panther Doom War, is out. But in April, I've had 3 big releases. April 5th, we had Mars 1, which is a standalone science fiction novel, hard science, about the first families going to colonize Mars, and it is based on existing science, existing politics, and so on. And it's in development for film. The Zucker Productions and Lonetree Entertainment have optioned for film, and we are now prowling around for screenwriters. We have a director already, so that came out, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of. Then last week we had Aliens Bug Hunt, which is an anthology of short fiction, all original short stories set in the world of the Colonial Marines from the Aliens movie franchise. And we have great writers in that, Dave Farland, Kevin J. Anderson, Heather Graham, Rachel Kane, Chris Golden, Tim Levin, Brian Keynes, on and on and on. Every writer is killer. That came out last week. And then tomorrow we have Dogs of War, which is the 9th book in my Joe Ledger Weird Science Thriller. The 9th book in the series that started with Patient Zero. And I absolutely love this book. It deals with a curated technological singularity, robotics, artificial intelligence, and nanotech used as terrorist weapons. And I really enjoyed that book, writing that book, doing the research for it, and I'm so happy it's now out.
Fantastic. Jonathan Maberry, it has been a distinct pleasure to get to talk with you today. Where can people find you on the web if they would like to follow your work and stay plugged in with what's coming new?
I'm pretty easy to find if you spell my last name right. Most people just want to put a Y in the middle of my name. They want to spell it Mayberry, but it's Maberry. So if you look for Jonathan Maberry, spelled the right way, you'll grab my website, which has tons and tons of cool stuff there. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, you name it. I'm all over the web. Very easy to find, and I guess my website's the easiest place to go because it has links to all my books and upcoming projects and so on. So it's jonathanmaberry.com.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Hank. Great questions, and really appreciate it. Hope to come back again sometime.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves. Pick up the entire Jason Crane series. Link in the show notes.
Jason Crane knelt before the grave of his great-great-great-grandmother with onion skin paper in his left hand and a stick of charcoal in his right. The paper rippled in the wind, threatening to twist and tear over the cemetery wall like an escaping ghost. He frowned and pressed it flush against the stone, pinning it at top with his palm and at bottom with his knee. He was a thin boy, bony as a grasshopper kneeling in a field. He wore his auburn hair short on the sides and tangled on top. He pushed it out of his eyes now, smudging his forehead, and went to work. He fanned the charcoal back and forth, bearing down to capture the design above the name, Scales of Justice, proclaiming the judgment of the dead. His grandmother had taught him to read such symbols: the sunflower of adoration, the cedar of consecration, the crown, the cypress, a frog for worldly pleasures, and a butterfly for the freeing of the spirit. He'd seen them all in the past 2 weeks. The headstone to his left bore an image of the raven, guardian of the cemetery. Letters shone through, finally, white against black. Annabelle Crane, beloved wife of Absalom, mother of Jesse, born August 15th, 1822, called to God August 1st, 1856. Jason stood, rolled the paper, and tucked it into a cardboard tube, careful not to smear the imprint. He lingered, though, leaning against the battered walnut tree, brushing at his blue jeans, enjoying a brief escape from his grandmother's lecturing and the barking of her small black poodle, named Charlie, though it was female. The tiny cemetery perched on a hill overlooking Bridgeport, Connecticut. Once it must have been a beautiful place to be buried, but Bridgeport had sprawled and suburbs had engulfed the area. Bulldozers had burgled away half the hill so that the former crest was now a cliff, leaving the cemetery situated precariously near an 8-foot plunge down to Chopsy Hill Drive. Above Jason's head, the walnut tree raised thin arms in sad, leafless benediction. 17 graves huddled in rows, herded by a faithful border fence. The weeds grew lushly, overtaking the headstones. No groundskeeper had visited this place in a long time, but a stained mattress lay in the mud, and someone had gang-tagged the marble of the single vault, someone named Naldi, apparently, who smoked Marlboro Lights and mistook the broken birdbath for an ashtray. Jason wanted to stay, to pull the weeds from Annabelle's grave, but the shadows were lengthening. Eliza didn't like to drive at night, and he didn't want to be among the graves after sunset. Oh no, even if they were family. His imagination slipped its leash. He saw himself clearing the earth, shoveling, finding the coffin, opening it, looking down at the browning skeleton and empty eye sockets of a woman he had never known, but who had made him possible. And what? Thanking her? Weeping for her? No, just meeting her. Hello, Annabelle. Guess who I am? Eliza honked again. Jason pushed his hair out of his eyes and scrambled down the hill. Reaching the bottom, he realized that very little shoveling would be required to reach that coffin. Thanks to the bulldozers, the dead were no longer 6 feet under, but only 2 feet inward. If he were to stand on the road and dig into the soft embankment, his ancestors were right there, within arm's reach, waiting. "That's awful," he said as he climbed into the driver's seat. "A good rain and half the coffins could be exposed." "Won't ever happen," said his grandmother. "A coffin from the 1850s is wood. It's all rotted through now. She'll stay put. The dead always stay put." They drove on. The cemetery on the hill dwindled in his side mirror. She'll stay put. The dead always stay put. The thought did not make him feel better. He suspected it might not be true. A dozen yards farther on, they pulled into a parking lot and ordered sandwiches from a strip mall Subway.
You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast with Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, please subscribe to the show and leave a comment over on iTunes.